August 15, 1945. The day the Emperor's voice crackled through radio speakers across the Pacific, announcing Japan's surrender. In Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima, the words fell like stones into silent waters. But in a dusty prisoner of war camp outside Amarillo, Texas, a group of 37 Japanese women heard the news in a place they never imagined they would be. These weren't soldiers. They were nurses, communication specialists, and administrative workers who had served the Imperial Japanese forces in the Philippines. Captured during the final months of the Pacific Campaign, they had been transported halfway around the world to the American heartland, to a place where the sky stretched endlessly in every direction, and men wore wide-brimmed hats and spoke with drawls they could barely understand. When Camp Commander Colonel William Harrison called them together that morning to announce the war's end, he expected relief, perhaps tears of joy. What he saw instead were faces frozen in a mixture of disbelief and terror. These women had been taught that surrender was worse than death, that American captors would show no mercy. For months, they had lived waiting for the cruelty they had been promised would come, yet it never did. And now, with the war over, they faced an impossible question. What would become of them? Among them stood 23-year-old Yuki Tanaka, a former military nurse from Kyoto. She had joined the war effort in 1942, believing she was serving the divine mission of her emperor. Now, standing in the Texas heat, she clutched a small silk pouch containing a photograph of her family. It was the only possession that had survived her capture and the long journey across the Pacific. The camp itself was unlike anything they had imagined. Situated on the edge of a sprawling cattle ranch, it consisted of simple wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. But beyond that wire lay a landscape that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Rolling plains of golden grass, massive herds of cattle, and ranch hands on horseback who looked more like characters from the Western films that had been banned in Japan than like the ruthless enemies they had been warned about. In the days following the surrender announcement, tension hung heavy in the camp. The Japanese women kept to themselves, speaking in hushed voices during meals, their eyes cast downward. They had been trained to expect the worst from their captors, taught that Americans were barbaric and cruel. But something strange had been happening since their arrival 3 months earlier, something that contradicted everything they thought they knew. It started with small gestures that made no sense to them. Extra blankets on cold nights, a guard who learned to say good morning in Japanese, a ranch cook who seemed genuinely concerned when one of them fell ill. The journey to Texas had begun in Manila Bay 3 months earlier, in May of 1945. The 37 women had been held in a makeshift detention facility near the docks, watching American ships come and go with a mixture of dread and fascination. They had been captured in different locations across the Philippines as Japanese forces collapsed under the American advance. Some had been taken from field hospitals, others from communication posts, and a few from administrative offices in Manila itself. They were brought together not because anyone knew what to do with them, but because no one did. Female Japanese prisoners were an unexpected complication in the final months of the Pacific War. Yuki remembered the morning they boarded the transport ship. She had expected to be treated like cargo, crammed into holds with minimal food and water. Instead, they were assigned to a below-deck compartment that, while sparse, had been fitted with bunks and basic sanitation facilities. An American nurse, a stern-faced woman named Lieutenant Patricia Chen, had been assigned to oversee their welfare during the voyage. Lieutenant Chen was second-generation Chinese-American, and her presence created a strange dynamic. The Japanese women had been taught to view the Chinese as inferior, conquered people. Yet here was a Chinese woman wearing the uniform of their conquerors, speaking with authority, treating them with a professional detachment that was neither cruel nor kind. The voyage across the Pacific took 19 days. The women spent most of their time in silent contemplation, each wrestling with private fears about what awaited them in America. They had heard stories, propaganda really, about how Americans treated prisoners, tales of torture and humiliation, of being put on display like animals in a zoo. 20-year-old Michiko Sato, who had worked as a radio operator, spent hours staring at the metal walls of their compartment, trying to prepare herself mentally for whatever horrors lay ahead. She had been raised in a small fishing village near Nagasaki, the youngest of 6 children. Her father had been so proud when she was selected for military service, seeing it as an honor for their family. Now she wondered if she would ever see him again, if he would ever know what had become of her. But something unexpected happened during that long voyage. Lieutenant Chen, despite her stern demeanor, began small acts of consideration. She brought them extra rations when someone fell seasick. She arranged for them to spend brief periods on deck, breathing fresh air and seeing the sun. She even taught a few English phrases to those who showed interest, though most were too frightened or proud to engage. It was Yuki who first dared to speak with her, asking in broken English about where they were being taken. "America is big," Lieutenant Chen had replied simply. "Texas is different from anything you know. The people there, they are different too. Cowboys, ranchers, they live by their own rules." They arrived at the port of Galveston on a face-and-dew, humid morning in late May. The air itself felt different here, thick and heavy, carrying scents of salt water mixed with something else they couldn't identify. Later they would learn it was the smell of oil refineries and cattle ranches, the twin pillars of Texas economy. From Galveston, they were loaded onto a military transport truck with canvas covers that blocked much of their view. What little they could see through the gaps astonished them. The sheer scale of everything. Roads that stretched straight to the horizon, buildings taller than any temple, cars everywhere moving with a casual abundance that seemed impossible in a nation at war. The drive to Amarillo took 2 full days with an overnight stop at a military facility outside Austin. During that stop, they encountered their first real Texans, guards and personnel who spoke with accents so thick the women could barely recognize it as English. But what struck them most wasn't the language barrier. It was the way these Americans looked at them, with curiosity rather than hatred, with something that almost resembled sympathy. One young guard, barely out of his teens, had stared at them with wide eyes before turning to his companion and saying in a voice loud enough to carry, "They're so small, so young. Makes you wonder what they told these girls about us." His companion had nodded solemnly. "Same lies we were told about them, I reckon." When they finally arrived at the camp outside Amarillo, exhaustion had dulled their fear into a numb acceptance. They were processed through intake by Colonel Harrison himself, who stood before them and delivered a speech through a translator. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the United States Army and the Geneva Conventions," he said. "You will be treated with dignity and respect as long as you follow camp rules. You will work, you will eat, you will be given medical care. The war may be ending soon, but until arrangements can be made for your repatriation, this will be your home." The word home struck Yuki as absurdly out of place. How could this foreign land, this enemy territory, ever be considered home? The barracks they were assigned to were simple but clean, wooden structures with rows of cots, each with a thin mattress and 2 blankets. Windows with screens let in the breeze, and there were communal washing facilities at one end. It was Spartan but far better than the crowded conditions they had endured during the voyage. That first night, lying on her cot and staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, Yuki listened to the sounds of Texas. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. Closer by, boots crunched on gravel as guards made their rounds. And strangest of all, she could hear music drifting from somewhere beyond the wire, a harmonica playing a melody that was both melancholy and somehow comforting. She fell asleep wondering what tomorrow would bring. Morning came with the sound of a bell ringing at 6 o'clock sharp. The women rose, uncertain of what was expected of them, and gathered in the small yard between their barracks. That was when they got their first real look at the men who would be their guards and supervisors for the foreseeable future. These weren't the crisp, formal military personnel they had encountered at the processing facilities. These were ranch hands, who had been deputized as auxiliary guards, men whose primary job was managing cattle and horses, not prisoners. They wore denim jeans, leather boots, and those distinctive wide-brimmed hats that seemed to define this corner of America. The most striking among them was a tall man in his mid-40s named James McCullough, the ranch foreman who had been appointed as the day-to-day supervisor of the prisoner work details. He had a weathered face that spoke of years under the Texas sun, hands that were calloused from decades of manual labor, and eyes that carried a surprising gentleness. When he addressed them that first morning, he removed his hat in a gesture of respect that caught them completely off guard. "Ladies," he said through the camp translator, a Japanese-American soldier named Henry Watanabe from California, "I know you're far from home and probably scared. We're going to put you to work because idle hands make for troubled minds. But we're going to treat you fair. You'll help in the kitchen, the laundry, the gardens. Some of you with medical training will assist our camp nurse. You work hard. We'll make sure you're taken care of." There was something in his tone, a straightforward honesty, that was impossible to fake. Yuki found herself studying his face, searching for signs of the cruelty she had been trained to expect, but finding only a kind of weary decency. Beside McCullough stood several other ranch hands. There was Tommy Chen, no relation to Lieutenant Patricia Chen, a young cowboy of Chinese descent whose family had worked Texas ranches for 3 generations. There was Miguel Santos, whose Mexican heritage gave him a natural empathy for people caught between cultures. And there was Robert "Buck" Williams, an older black cowboy whose presence surprised the Japanese women most of all. They had been taught that America oppressed people of color, yet here was a black man working alongside white men with apparent equality, carrying authority and respect. Buck noticed their stares and offered a slight smile. "I know what you're thinking," he said through Watanabe's translation. "Wondering how a man like me fits in here. Well, out on the range, what matters is whether you can rope a steer and ride through a storm. Color don't mean much when you're working cattle." His words hung in the air, challenging everything they thought they understood about America. These cowboys, these men who were supposed to be their enemies, seemed to operate by rules that defied the propaganda they had been fed for years. The incident that would change everything happened on their 3rd day at the camp. It started when Michiko Sato collapsed during morning work detail in the vegetable garden. The Texas heat, combined with dehydration and the stress of captivity, had overwhelmed her small frame. She crumpled between rows of tomato plants, her face pale despite the sun beating down. The other women rushed to her side, their movements frantic with worry and helplessness. They had no medical supplies, no authority to seek help, and years of propaganda had convinced them that showing weakness to their captors would invite cruelty. But what happened next shattered their expectations. Tommy Chen, who had been supervising their work detail, immediately radioed for the camp nurse, and then did something that left them speechless. He removed his own hat and used it to fan Michiko's face. He pulled a canteen from his belt and carefully tilted water to her lips, supporting her head with surprising gentleness. "Stay with us, miss," he said softly, even though she couldn't understand his words. "You're going to be all right." When the nurse arrived minutes later, Tommy helped carry Michiko to the infirmary himself, cradling her as carefully as he would an injured calf. That afternoon, James McCullough made a decision that would become legendary in the camp's brief history. He gathered the ranch hands and told them they were going to prepare something special for the prisoners. "If these ladies are going to work in this heat," he declared, "they need proper food. Not just rations, real food. And I know just the thing." What followed was a flurry of activity that the Japanese women watched with growing bewilderment. McCullough and Buck Williams set up a large outdoor cooking station near the mess hall. They brought out cast-iron skillets, the kind that had been seasoned by generations of use. Miguel Santos appeared with crates of fresh chicken from the ranch's own coops. Tommy Chen gathered flour, spices, and buttermilk from the kitchen stores. The cowboys worked with the easy coordination of men who had cooked together on countless cattle drives and roundups. Buck prepared his grandmother's secret spice blend, a mixture of salt, black pepper, paprika, and cayenne that had been passed down through his family since their days cooking for trail drives. McCullough showed the younger hands how to properly dredge the chicken pieces, ensuring every inch was coated in the seasoned flour. The oil in those massive skillets began to heat, and soon the air filled with a smell that was completely foreign to the Japanese women. Rich, savory, carrying notes of spice and comfort that made their mouths water despite their confusion and fear. They had never encountered anything like fried chicken before. In Japan, chicken was typically grilled, boiled in broth, or served in small portions. This, whatever it was, smelled like something altogether different, something that spoke of abundance and care. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when McCullough and his crew finished preparing the meal. They had fried enough chicken to feed the entire camp, golden brown pieces stacked high on platters, still crackling with heat. Alongside the chicken, they had prepared cornbread, coleslaw, and baked beans, a classic Texas ranch meal that represented hospitality in its purest form. The Cowboys set up long tables in the outdoor area between the barracks, a space that had previously been used only for roll call and announcements. They covered the tables with simple cloth and arranged the food family style, as if preparing for a Sunday dinner rather than feeding enemy prisoners. When the women were called to the tables, they approached with visible hesitation. Yuki exchanged glances with the others, trying to understand what was happening. Was this some kind of test? A prelude to humiliation? In their experience, nothing came without a cost, especially not kindness from enemies. But McCullough simply stood at the head of the table, hat in hand once again, and spoke through interpreter. Watanabe. Ladies, in Texas, we believe in treating guests at our table with respect. War or no war, you're human beings far from home, working hard in difficult conditions. This here is how we show appreciation. Please, sit and eat. There was no mockery in his voice, no hidden cruelty, just simple, genuine hospitality. Slowly, uncertainly, the women took their seats. The Cowboys served them, passing platters and explaining through gestures and Watanabe's translation what each dish was. When the fried chicken reached Yuki, she stared at it with fascination and trepidation. The golden crust gleamed with oil, and the aroma was intoxicating. She watched as Buck demonstrated how to pick up a piece with your hands, something that felt almost scandalous given her upbringing in formal Japanese dining culture. Following his example, she lifted a piece of chicken breast to her mouth and took her first bite. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced. The crispy coating gave way with a satisfying crunch, yielding to tender, juicy meat inside. The spices, foreign to her palate, created a symphony of flavors that was simultaneously rich, savory, and just slightly spicy. The heat of the cayenne built slowly, warming rather than burning. She found herself taking another bite, then another, unable to stop despite years of training in modest eating habits. Around her, she heard small gasps and exclamations from the other women as they tasted the chicken for the first time. Michiko, recovered from her earlier collapse and insisting she was well enough to join them, had tears streaming down her face as she ate. Whether from the spices, emotion, or both, Yuki couldn't tell. Even the most stoic among them, former officer administrator Haruko Nakamura, allowed herself a small smile of genuine pleasure. Something was shifting in that moment, something profound. With each bite of fried chicken, with each gesture of uncomplicated kindness, the walls they had built around themselves began to crack. In the weeks following that first meal, a tentative routine established itself at the camp. The women worked their assigned duties during the day, tended the gardens, helped in the kitchen, and assisted the camp nurse with basic medical tasks. But the evenings became something different, something unexpected. The Cowboys began teaching them about ranch life, showing them how to mend leather, identify different cattle breeds, and understand the rhythms of life on the Texas plains. In return, some of the women began sharing small pieces of their own culture, teaching a few Japanese phrases, explaining festivals and traditions from their homeland. Yuki found herself drawn to these evening exchanges despite her initial resistance. One night, she approached McCullough with a request through Watanabe. She wanted to write letters home to her family in Kyoto to let them know she was alive and well. McCullough's expression grew somber. "Miss Tanaka," he said gently, "I wish I could help you with that. But right now, there's no mail service between here and Japan. The war just ended, and everything's still chaos over there. Your letters, they wouldn't reach anyone even if I let you send them." The news hit Yuki harder than she expected. She had been holding on to the hope that somehow she could reach across the vast ocean and touch home again. Let her parents know their daughter had survived. Seeing her distress, McCullough made an offer that surprised everyone. "Tell you what," he said. "You write your letters anyway. Write everything you want to say to your family. We'll keep them safe here, and when the time comes that mail service opens up, we'll make sure they get sent. In the meantime, putting your thoughts on paper, it helps. I wrote letters to my son every day when he was fighting in France, even before I knew if he was alive to receive them. Just the act of writing, it kept me connected to him." Yuki accepted this compromise and began writing that very night. Sitting on her cot with paper and pencil provided by the camp administration, she poured out her heart in careful Japanese characters. "Dear Father and Mother," she wrote, I am alive and well in a place called Texas. I know you must be worried, must have wondered what became of me when communication stopped. I want you to know that I am being treated with unexpected kindness. The Americans here, they are not what we were told. They feed us well, sometimes too well. There is a dish they make, fried chicken they call it, that tastes like comfort itself. Other women began writing too, filling pages with messages of love, apology, confusion, and hope. They wrote about the cowboys who defied every expectation, about meals shared under wide Texas skies, about slowly learning that enemies could become something else entirely. These letters, tucked away in a box in McCullough's office, became a chronicle of transformation, a record of walls coming down one word at a time. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It came in small moments that accumulated like dust settling into the cracks of old wood. One afternoon in late June, Buck Williams was teaching a group of women how to identify different plants in the Texas landscape, pointing out which were edible and which were dangerous. He showed them prickly pear cactus and explained how his grandmother had made jelly from its fruit. 24-year-old Emiko Hayashi, who had worked as a pharmacist assistant before the war, found herself fascinated by this practical knowledge. She began asking questions through Watanabe, her curiosity overcoming her trained reserve. Buck responded with patience and enthusiasm, clearly pleased to have someone interested in wisdom he had learned from his elders. He told her about mesquite beans and their uses, about herbs that could soothe stomach ailments, about the medicinal properties of creosote bush. As he talked, Emiko realized she was seeing him not as a guard or an enemy, but as a teacher, a keeper of valuable knowledge. She thought of her own grandmother back in Hiroshima, who had taught her about traditional Japanese herbs and remedies. The realization struck her suddenly that healing knowledge transcended borders, that the desire to preserve and pass on wisdom was universal. That same week, Tommy Chen organized a baseball game during the prisoners' recreation time. Most of the Japanese women had never seen baseball played, though some had heard of it as an American sport that had gained popularity in Japan before the war. Tommy patiently explained the rules, demonstrating how to hold a bat, how to throw a ball, how the bases worked. To everyone's surprise, Michiko turned out to have natural talent. Her small stature worked to her advantage as she learned to dodge and weave, and her precision from years of operating radio equipment translated well to throwing accuracy. When she hit her first solid contact and ran squealing with delight to first base, both prisoners and guards erupted in cheers. The sound of that laughter, genuine and unburdened, marked another shift in the camp's atmosphere. Miguel Santos, watching from the sidelines, remarked to McCullough that he kept forgetting these were supposed to be prisoners. "They're just young women a long way from home," he said, shaking his head. "Could be my sisters, my cousins." Makes you think about what we're told to believe about people we've never met. McCullough nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "That's the thing about war, Miguel. It requires us to stop seeing the humanity in others. But peace, real peace, requires us to see it again. These women, they're helping us remember how." In the evenings, the women began gathering voluntarily in the common area rather than retreating immediately to their barracks. They would sit and watch the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple, colors that reminded Yuki of home despite the alien landscape. Sometimes, the cowboys would join them, and in the comfortable silence that developed between people who were learning to coexist, something like friendship began to take root. Language remained a barrier, but one that both sides worked to overcome with surprising dedication. Interpreter Henry Watanabe found himself stretched thin, unable to be everywhere at once, so an organic system of communication began to develop. The cowboys learned Japanese words for common objects and actions. The women picked up English phrases with increasing confidence. But more importantly, they discovered that some things didn't need translation at all. A smile meant the same thing in any language. So did a helping hand extended without being asked, or the sharing of a particularly good piece of chicken at dinner. Yuki emerged as one of the natural bridges between the two groups. She had studied English in school back in Kyoto, enough to have a foundation to build on. In the evenings, she would sit with McCullough and Buck, practicing conversation while they taught her idioms and colloquialisms that no textbook had ever covered. "You can't judge a book by its cover," Buck explained one night, and Yuki pondered this strange phrase about books and covers before understanding bloomed. "Ah," she said slowly, "like you cannot know a person by only looking, you must know their heart." "Exactly," Buck replied with a grin. "You're getting the hang of it." Through these conversations, Yuki learned about McCullough's son, Daniel, who had served in the European theater and returned home with wounds both visible and invisible. She learned about Buck's childhood in East Texas, about the grandfather who had been born into slavery and lived to see his grandchildren work as free men. She learned about Tommy's family restaurant in Houston, about Miguel's ranch near the Mexican border, about lives that were as complex and nuanced as her own. In turn, she shared stories of Kyoto's cherry blossoms, of her father's bookshop, of studying calligraphy as a child and believing she might become a teacher before the war changed everything. These exchanges created understanding that went deeper than any propaganda could reach. When Haruko Nakamura, the former administrator, finally began speaking about her experience, she revealed that her brother had been killed at Midway. She had volunteered for military service partly from grief, partly from a desire to honor his sacrifice. When she finished speaking, her voice tight with old pain, McCullough was quiet for a long moment. "My son lost his best friend at Normandy," he finally said. "Tommy here lost a cousin at Iwo Jima. Grief doesn't choose sides in war, it just takes and takes until we're all diminished by it." The women also learned about American racism and inequality through these honest conversations. Buck spoke candidly about segregation, about doors that remained closed to people who looked like him despite their service and sacrifice. It confused the Japanese women who had been told America was a unified force of oppression. Instead, they discovered a country struggling with its own contradictions, its own journey toward living up to its stated ideals. The complexity made America seem more real, more human, and somehow more hopeful than the monolithic enemy they had imagined. As summer deepened into early fall, the camp's vegetable gardens began yielding their bounty. The women had been tending these plots since their arrival, and now they harvested tomatoes, squash, peppers, and beans with a sense of pride that surprised them. There was something deeply satisfying about watching seeds become food, about the simple act of nurturing growth in this foreign soil. Emiko, who had taken charge of the herb garden, successfully grew several medicinal plants and even managed to cultivate shiso, a Japanese herb that one of the guards had somehow procured seeds for. The sight of those familiar leaves growing in Texas dirt brought tears to her eyes. McCullough decided to hold a harvest celebration, bringing together ranch traditions with what little the women had taught them about Japanese customs. The Cowboys prepared their usual feast of fried chicken, barbecued beef, and cornbread. But this time, the Japanese women contributed dishes of their own, improvising with available ingredients to create approximations of home cooking. They made rice balls with precious rice that had been specially ordered. They created vegetable dishes seasoned with soy sauce from Watanabe's personal supply. They even attempted a simplified version of miso soup. Though without proper fermented paste, the result was more of a savory broth than authentic miso. The fusion of cuisines created a meal that belonged to neither culture entirely but somehow represented both. As they ate together that evening, with lanterns strung between the barracks, creating pools of warm light, something remarkable occurred. Haruko began to sing. Her voice, clear and haunting, carried a traditional Japanese folk song about harvest time and gratitude for the earth's gifts. The melody rose into the darkening sky, and one by one, other women joined her, their voices blending in harmony. The Cowboys listened in respectful silence, moved by the beauty of sounds they couldn't understand but could feel in their bones. When the song ended, Buck pulled out his harmonica and began playing a slow, mournful tune that spoke of long trails and distant homes. Miguel joined in with his guitar, and soon Tommy was keeping rhythm with spoons against his knee. The music they made together was neither Japanese nor American but something entirely new, born from the unexpected community they had built. Yuki found herself swaying to the rhythm, her body remembering joy, even as her mind still struggled with the cognitive dissonance of feeling happy among those who should have been enemies. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and people began drifting back to their quarters, McCullough approached Yuki. "Miss Tanaka," he said, "I want you to know something. When this camp was first established, I wasn't sure how it would work. Didn't know if we could make it humane, given everything that happened in this war. But watching tonight, seeing what you ladies and my men have built together, I think we've found something important here. Something about what comes after the fighting stops." Yuki nodded, understanding exactly what he meant, even if she couldn't yet find the English words to express her agreement. September brought news that shattered the fragile peace they had constructed. It arrived through official military channels, reports that Colonel Harrison received and struggled with before deciding the women deserved to know the truth. He called them together in the mess hall on a morning when the air had turned crisp with the first hints of autumn. Through Watanabe's careful translation, he told them about the atomic bombs, about Hiroshima on August 6th, about Nagasaki on August 9th, about the unprecedented destruction, the fires that consumed cities in moments, the shadows of people burned into stone, the radiation that continued to kill long after the explosions faded. The silence that followed was absolute. Emiko's face went pale as paper. "Nagasaki," she whispered. "My grandmother lives in Nagasaki." "Lived," she corrected herself, her voice hollow. "Lived in Nagasaki." Around her, other women began to process what they had heard. Some had family in Hiroshima. Others had friends, colleagues, people they loved who might have been in those cities on those terrible days. The realization that while they had been eating fried chicken and learning English phrases and laughing at baseball games, their entire world had been burning, hit them like a physical blow. Yuki felt her knees weaken. Kyoto had been spared, she knew from the reports, but her city's survival came at the cost of 2 others being destroyed beyond imagination. She thought of all the letters she had written home, filled with stories of kindness and unexpected friendship. What did any of that matter now? How could she have been building connections with Americans while American weapons were erasing entire cities full of Japanese civilians? The guilt threatened to drown her. For days after the announcement, the camp fell into mourning. The women withdrew into themselves, the progress of months seeming to evaporate overnight. They stopped attending the evening gatherings. They spoke only when necessary. The weight of what had happened settled over them like ash from those distant fires. The Cowboys, for their part, didn't know how to respond. They had celebrated the bombs as necessary to end the war, as salvation for the thousands of American soldiers who would have died in a land invasion of Japan. But seeing the faces of these women they had come to know, seeing their grief made personal and immediate, complicated that simple narrative. McCullough found himself unable to sleep, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Buck sat alone on the porch of the bunkhouse, his harmonica silent for the first time in weeks. Even Tommy, usually quick with a smile, moved through his duties with a heavy heart. It was Yuki who finally broke the silence, almost 2 weeks after the news had arrived. She approached McCullough one evening as he stood watching the sunset. "The war is over," she said in careful English, "because of those bombs. Many Americans are alive because of those bombs. Many Japanese are dead because of those bombs. Both things are true. Both things are terrible. I do not know how to feel both gratitude and grief together, but I think I must learn." McCullough's response to Yuki's words was measured and honest. "I don't know how to hold those feelings together either," he admitted. "My son is alive because the war ended when it did. He was scheduled to be in the first wave of invasion forces. So part of me is grateful, beyond measure. But another part of me looks at you ladies and thinks about all the other daughters, mothers, sisters who didn't survive those bombs. There's no clean answer here, Miss Tanaka, just a lot of people trying to live with impossible choices." His honesty opened a door that had nearly closed. Slowly, tentatively, conversations resumed between the prisoners and their guards. But these talks were different now, deeper and more raw than before. The women began asking hard questions about American decisions, about the morality of weapons that couldn't distinguish between soldiers and civilians, between military targets and children. The Cowboys, in turn, shared their own doubts and moral struggles. Buck spoke about the contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied full rights at home. Miguel talked about watching Mexican-American soldiers die for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. Tommy confessed his family's internment camp experience, how Japanese-American citizens like himself had been imprisoned without trial, while he had to prove his loyalty by serving in uniform. We're all trying to reconcile what America promises with what America does, he said. It's not simple for any of us. These conversations, painful as they were, created a new kind of understanding. The women began to see America not as a monolithic force but as a complicated collection of people struggling with their own contradictions. Similarly, the Cowboys began to understand that the women weren't simply representatives of Imperial Japan, but individuals caught in forces beyond their control, trying to make sense of a world that had asked them to be both victims and participants in terrible things. Haruko spoke one evening about her brother, the one killed at Midway. I believed his death was noble and necessary, she said quietly. Now I wonder if any death in war is truly noble, or if we just tell ourselves that so we can bear the grief. Maybe the only noble thing is trying to make sure no more brothers have to die. The turning point came when Colonel Harrison announced that arrangements were being made for repatriation. Ships would be available in December to transport Japanese prisoners back to their homeland. The women would be going home. Yuki expected to feel joy at this news, but instead she felt only confusion and uncertainty. Home had become a complicated concept. Japan was where her family lived, where she had been born and raised, where her identity had been formed. But Japan was also devastated, occupied by foreign forces, transformed into something she might not recognize. And Texas, this strange place with its endless skies and cowboy kindness, had begun to feel like something more than just a prison camp. It had become a place where she had learned hard truths about herself, about her country, about the possibility of transformation. The announcement of repatriation created a strange atmosphere in the camp. The women should have been celebrating, counting down days until they could return home. Instead, many found themselves troubled by emotions they couldn't fully articulate. Michiko confessed to Yuki one night that she was terrified of returning to Japan. "What will I tell my family about where I have been?" she asked. "How do I explain that I learned to laugh with Americans? That I ate their food and enjoyed it? That I forgot, sometimes for whole hours, that we were supposed to be enemies? They will think I betrayed our country. Maybe I did." Yuki had no answers because she wrestled with the same questions. She thought about the letters she had written, still carefully stored in McCullough's office, chronicles of transformation that might seem like treason to people who hadn't lived through them. She thought about the version of herself who had arrived in May, rigid with propaganda and fear, and compared her to the person she had become. That earlier self felt like a stranger now. The change had been so gradual, so organic, that she hadn't noticed it happening until it was complete. Now she stood between two versions of herself, uncertain which one would be welcomed home. The Cowboys noticed the women's ambivalence and struggled to understand it. "You're going home," Tommy said to Emiko one afternoon. "Isn't that what you've wanted all along?" Emiko paused in her gardening, her hands stilling in the soil. "I thought so," she replied slowly. "But home is where my grandmother was, and she is gone. Home is a Japan that no longer exists. I am not sure what I am returning to. Maybe I am not even sure who I am anymore." Her words hung heavy in the autumn air, expressing a truth that many others felt but couldn't voice. It was Buck who first suggested something radical. He approached McCullough one evening as they stood watching the women tend their gardens for what might be the last time. "Boss," he said carefully, "what if some of them don't want to go back? What if they wanted to stay here instead?" McCullough's first response was to dismiss the idea as impossible. "They're prisoners of war, Buck. They don't get to choose where they live." But Buck persisted. "The war's over. They're not enemy combatants anymore, just displaced people. And some of them, they've got nothing to return to. Families gone, cities destroyed. Meanwhile here, they've built something. They've got skills, they've learned English, they've become part of this community. Seems like there ought to be a way to let them stay if they want to." The idea, once spoken, took root. McCullough began making inquiries through official channels, contacting military authorities and immigration offices. The response was complicated. There was no precedent for this situation, no clear procedure for enemy prisoners requesting to remain in America. But the unusual circumstances of the war's end, combined with the humanitarian crisis in occupied Japan, meant that exceptions might be possible. It would require paperwork, sponsorship, and approval from multiple agencies. But it wasn't impossible. McCullough called a meeting with all 37 women in mid-November. Through Watanabe, he explained what he had learned. "Ladies," he began, "you have orders for repatriation in December. Those orders still stand, and any of you who wish to return to Japan will be transported with full assistance. But I've been working with Colonel Harrison and officials in Washington, and we may have another option. For those who want to stay in America, we might be able to arrange sponsorship and immigration status. It won't be easy, and there are no guarantees, but if you want to try, we're willing to help make it happen." The announcement sparked intense discussion among the women. Some knew immediately they wanted to return. Haruko, despite everything she had learned and experienced, felt a deep obligation to help rebuild Japan. "My country needs people who understand what went wrong," she said firmly. "People who can help make sure we never follow that path again. I must go back, even knowing how difficult it will be." Others were equally certain they wanted to stay. Emiko had lost her entire family in Nagasaki. The thought of returning to that devastated city, walking streets where her grandmother's house had stood, was more than she could bear. "Here, I have found purpose," she explained. "I have the garden, the medical work. I have people who see me as myself, not just as enemy or victim. What is waiting for me in Japan except ghosts?" Michiko was torn. Part of her desperately wanted to see her father and siblings again, to return to the fishing village where she had grown up. But another part feared their judgment, worried that the person she had become would be unrecognizable to them. She spent sleepless nights weighing her choice, writing in her own journal all the reasons for staying and all the reasons for leaving, trying to find clarity in the words. Yuki found herself in a similar state of paralysis. Her family was alive, her city intact. By all logic, she should return. But the thought of leaving Texas, leaving the people who had shown her a different way of being in the world, filled her with unexpected grief. She sought McCullough's advice one evening. "I do not know how to choose," she confessed. "Both paths seem right and wrong at the same time. How do I decide?" McCullough removed his hat, a gesture she had learned meant he was about to say something important. "Miss Tanaka," he said gently, "there's no wrong choice here. You go back to Japan, you can help rebuild a country that desperately needs people like you, people who've seen beyond the hatred. You stay here. You can help build bridges between our countries, show Americans what Japanese people are really like. Either way, you're doing something meaningful. The question isn't which choice is right, it's which choice feels true to who you've become." Yuki realized he was right. This wasn't about logic or obligation. It was about listening to the quiet voice inside that knew what she needed, even if she couldn't yet articulate why. December arrived with cold winds that swept across the Texas plains, carrying the scent of winter and change. The day came when the women had to declare their intentions. Colonel Harrison set up individual meetings where each could state her choice privately, without pressure from others. Of the 37 women, 22 chose to return to Japan. 15, including Yuki, Emiko, and Michiko, chose to stay. The decision to remain required courage that surprised even those who made it. They would be signing up for lives as permanent foreigners, marked forever as former enemies in a country still processing its wartime trauma. They would face discrimination, suspicion, and the constant challenge of proving their worth and loyalty. But they would also have opportunities that devastated Japan couldn't offer. McCullough and the other ranch hands worked tirelessly to secure sponsorships for each woman who wanted to stay. Buck connected Emiko with a hospital in nearby Amarillo that was desperately short of nursing staff. Her medical experience and gentle manner made her an ideal candidate, and the hospital director, a pragmatic woman named Dr. Martha Henderson, agreed to sponsor her immigration paperwork. Tommy's family restaurant in Houston offered positions to 3 of the women, promising training in American cooking techniques and hospitality. Miguel's brother, who ran a large produce operation, agreed to sponsor 2 others who had proven themselves gifted gardeners. For Yuki, McCullough made a personal offer. His ranch needed someone to help manage the accounts and correspondence, work that required both literacy and attention to detail. More than that, he said he needed someone who could help him understand the changing world, someone who could bridge the gap between old assumptions and new realities. "My son is home, but he's struggling," McCullough admitted. "Seeing you ladies, seeing how you've changed and grown, it's helped me understand what Danny might be going through. Having you here, working with us, I think it would be good for all of us. The women who chose to return were not making an easier choice, only a different one. They would carry with them memories of kindness that contradicted everything they had been taught, stories that might help other Japanese people see Americans as human beings rather than demons. Haruko embraced Yuki before leaving, holding her tightly. "Tell them," she whispered urgently. "When people ask you about Americans, tell them the truth. Tell them about the cowboys who fed us fried chicken and taught us that enemies can become friends. Tell them that peace is possible." The day of separation was heavy with tears and promises. The women boarding the transport trucks clutched letters and small gifts from the cowboys who had become their friends. Buck gave Emiko his grandmother's recipe for fried chicken, carefully written out in English with Tommy's help. "This is part of my family now," he told her. "I want it to be part of yours too." McCullough gave each departing woman an envelope containing the letters they had written during their imprisonment, finally ready to be delivered to families who had spent months not knowing if their daughters were alive. 25 years after that extraordinary day when Japanese women prisoners chose to remain in Texas, Yuki McCullough stood before a gathering at the Amarillo Public Library. She had married James McCullough's son Daniel 3 years after the war ended, finding in him a fellow soul who understood what it meant to be changed by conflict. Together they had raised 2 children who carried both Japanese and American heritage with pride. She had been invited to speak about reconciliation, about the unlikely friendships forged in a prisoner of war camp that became something far more significant than anyone could have predicted. The small camp outside Amarillo was long gone, dismantled within a year of the war's end. But its legacy lived on in the lives it had transformed. Yuki spoke about that first taste of fried chicken, how something as simple as a meal prepared with care had begun the process of seeing enemies as human beings. She described the cowboys who had chosen kindness over cruelty, who had demonstrated that strength could be gentle and that compassion was not weakness. The audience listened intently, many hearing this story for the first time, though it had happened in their own community. Emiko sat in the front row, now head nurse at Amarillo General Hospital, her reputation for skill and compassion known throughout the region. Beside her was Michiko, who had eventually brought her father to America and now ran a successful translation service helping new immigrants navigate their adopted country. Of the 15 women who had stayed, all had found ways to contribute, to build lives that honored both their heritage and their chosen home. They had faced discrimination and difficulty, moments when their accents or appearances made them targets of lingering wartime hatred, but they had also found acceptance, carved out spaces where they belonged, proved through years of dedication that former enemies could become valued community members. Buck Williams, now in his 70s but still sharp as a tack, stood when Yuki finished speaking. "I want to add something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "What happened at that camp? It taught me that the stories we tell ourselves about who the enemy is, those stories can change, must change, if we're ever going to have real peace. Those young women taught us that redemption goes both ways. They learned Americans weren't demons. We learned Japanese weren't either. That's the lesson we can't afford to forget." The room erupted in applause, and Yuki felt tears streaming down her face. She thought about the frightened young woman who had arrived in Texas 3 decades earlier, convinced she was facing certain cruelty, and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. After the event, people crowded around to hear more stories, to touch this living piece of history. A young reporter asked Yuki what she wanted people to remember most about her experience. She thought for a moment before answering. "Remember that kindness is never wasted, even shown to enemies. Remember that people can change, can choose to be better than what their governments demand. And remember that sometimes the most powerful victory is not defeating your enemy, but transforming them into your friend. Remember fried chicken served with hope under a Texas sky."